Stocks delivering their best three-day rally since November. Steve Eisman of Neuberger Berman saying he's long-oriented on the US market, focusing on companies like Apple that are positioning for the second wave of AI. And he has a ton to say about US politics, which is rare these days. Steve is with us around a table. Steve, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I'm going to ask it then. First question, who wins?
So, caveat first.
Okay.
I'm not speaking for Neuberger Berman. I'm speaking just for myself. Don't want to get into trouble. And what I'm about to say is just pure political analysis. And the analogy I'll draw is to the financial crisis. You know, in August of 2007, the subprime paper market collapsed. And at that point, when you look back on it, the financial crisis was baked. Everything else was completely inevitable. So I think that it is completely inevitable at this point that Donald Trump will win every single swing state and will get elected. And the reason I think this way will unfold is part one of this story is that the protesters in all the universities are becoming the face of the Democratic Party. But that's not 100% at this point. But what's going to solidify it is in August at the Democratic Convention, which is in Chicago, ironically, you'll see all these protesters again, and a lot of them will be screaming and yelling things like not just death to Israel, but death to America, because they can't help themselves. And the country will be appalled. And that'll be it. It'll be over.
Let's say you're right. Crystal ball, dead on. Next question is, what do I do with that information, and when do I put the trades on? And what are the trades? How do you sort of go through that process?
I would say you do largely nothing, because I don't think that whether Trump wins or Biden wins has any real impact on the economy at all. You know, there'll be things that people will want to trade, which I'm not going to talk about because I haven't put on those trades yet. Because it's too early. But there'll be things to do. But that'll just be short-term trades.
Can you touch on it there, Steve? Can I jump in? That's what I'm interested in. You said it's too early. When is the right time to really think about expressing these as trades?
Oh, I think when in August, when at the convention, when I said happens, everybody will realize that that's the case.
So you said that it doesn't really matter who gets elected.
Yes.
That's fascinating to me, because some people are saying that Donald Trump would put on pretty significant tariffs, particularly to China, and that this would increase inflation, sort of de facto, in the United States. I see you rolling your eyes. You can respond in a second. And then at the same time, you're going to have, the tax cuts reinstated.
And cats and dogs will be lying together, and it'll be end of the world and doom, gloom, and whatever.
Well, cats and dogs lying together. Yeah. I don't know. It could be doom, gloom, depending on your view. But what do you make of this? Why do you discount this?
I mean, do I think that Donald Trump would increase tariffs to China? Sure. Do I think that would have a massive inflationary impact in the United States? I think that's ridiculous. So, on the margin, would it impact, for example, I'll give you a company, First Solar. So First Solar sells solar panels to utilities. Now, there are already massive tariffs that are helping them now. Could Trump increase the tariffs or make them longer so that stock would do better? Could be. But, are the price of T-shirts going to go up? Is the price of food going to go up? No. I mean, you have to remember that the United States is of all the developed world, the United States is the most insular economy of any developed world. So the fact that tariffs will go on in China, big deal.
But one thing you recently spoke about was infrastructure spending and how you like all of those trades.
Yes.
What happens to all of that if Trump becomes elected? Because all of that is attached to the Biden administration.
Well, true. But don't forget that the solar tariffs were put on by Trump originally. More than 50% of all the government spending is actually going to red states. So I don't think he's going to want to mess with his own voters. Could there be tinkering at the edges? Sure. Are there enough votes in the United States Senate to repeal the IIJ Act and the IRA Act? They're not even close. So, rhetoric, you'll hear lots of rhetoric about repealing the IRA or changing the IRA, and, stocks will move on that. But at the end of the day, nothing will happen.
So spending will continue.
Yes.
Tax cuts will get extended.
Yes.
Tariffs on the margin will be there.
Yep.
This, to me, raises questions that a lot of people have talked about, which is the deficit not going away at the time where you're going to have to see some of the issuance numbers really start to pick up. You seem to discount that, too. You don't think that necessarily...
100%. Okay, it's not an issue.
Okay, so you don't think the deficit's an issue?
It's not an issue. Can I tell you why? I'm not an economist. I can only say this. That the people who have been complaining about the deficit, and I like to call them the deficit people, okay?
Because that's what it sounds like.
Because that's what they sound like. have been saying, the deficit for 40 years.
I know, my
okay,
grandfather.
40 years. Now, look, in my business, being too early is the equivalent of being wrong. But in my business, when you're too early, you're a year too early. You're 2 years too early. You're not 40 years too early. When you're 40 years too early, you probably should just shut up and keep your mouth shut. But I would say this, that the sign that the oil the deficit group will be right is when rates actually go up a lot. Until then, everybody should just keep quiet.
But how do you know when that's going to happen?
Well,
right?
you'll see it. On
okay, but are we getting close to that
We'll be on the
point?
show and you'll say, wow, long-term rates went up 50 basis points in one day.
Boy, that deficit.
And then they will say
so natural
they were
coming out of your
finally
mouth.
right after 40, 50 years. Until then, it's not relevant.
Well, but this to me is a real question because people increasingly are focused on this in the market. People who actually can determine what those rates are can send those rates to up 50 basis
and are
points
they
in one day.
selling treasuries?
Well,
are rates going up?
There was a time when
they're
they were.
talking and they're doing nothing.
So are you basically saying that you are long-term rates because you think that all of this discussion about the deficit is still way too early and all these people are going to be proven
that's
wrong?
going to become a meme now.
I hope so.
And I literally just made it up.
Well, that's fantastic. It's really good. So answer the question.
I lost the train of thought.
Okay, well, I'm just saying, if at what point do you say, okay, if we think that the discussion of the deficit is overblown, go into long treasuries, buy them, because all the people who are worried about that are going to be proven wrong.
Well, I mean, look, I'm not really a bond person. I'm more of a stock jockey. So, what caused the market to go down in 2022? The Fed raised rates 500 basis points. I don't think the Fed's going to be raising rates. Do I think the Fed's going to cut rates? Maybe. I actually don't think it doesn't really matter because even if they cut, they're only cutting a little bit. They're certainly not cutting 500 basis points. People like to talk about it on Fed Day as if, Moses came down from Sinai with the tablets and let's examine whether the 10 commandments are on there because we'll look at whether there was a comma removed that's so significant. Let's buy the S&P,
He wears a bow tie and he sits right there.
He said wow, what does that mean?
So then how do
So you know what? It's not relevant.
Okay, so you don't necessarily see the potential rate cutting cycle as particularly relevant to your stock picking. At the same time, we've seen
there's no aggressive rate cycle cutting. That would matter. If the Fed's going to cut rates once, twice, to tinker at the edges,
we can live with 5%. Is that the
irrelevant.
message? We can live with 5%.
We seem to be living just fine with it right now.
Yeah.
The economy is fine, which I think is a surprise to everybody.
It raises an important question. I was listening to the podcast you did with Tracy and Joe. It was fantastic, by the way. And if you haven't listened to it at home, you should do. Odd Lots. And you talked about good times is for storytelling, bad times is for the focus on a balance sheet. Is this a good time or a bad time?
This is definitely a good time.
It's a good time.
And I'll just repeat what I said on that show because I like it. Is that there are three great themes of our time. There's AI, there's everything having to do with infrastructure, and there's crypto. And I believe in the first two, and I don't believe in the third.
Why not the third?
Look, there's two questions with respect to crypto. Is it a currency? And if it's a currency, should you own it? So let's skip the first part, but that's like is it a currency is like having a discussion about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. There's no structure to it. So if it's a currency, why should you own it? So let's ask the people who own crypto, why do they own it? They all say the same thing. They say, fiat currency, the deficit people. It's definitely going to be a meme.
we're trying.
I created my first meme.
Not yet.
And it's a hedge against the demise of fiat currency. Cats and dogs one day will lie together. You'll be in a cave, but at least you'll have your crypto. It's like digital gold. That's the thesis. So, okay, let's take them at their word. So if that's the thesis, then on days where everybody's worried about inflation, they're worried about the deficit, and NASDAQ is down 300 points, and interest rates are up, crypto should be up. And on days where everybody's feeling great, NVIDIA's up, and NASDAQ is up, and rates are down, and nobody cares about inflation, crypto should be down. And does it act that way? It does not. It acts exactly the opposite of its own thesis. Its correlation to NASDAQ is like 75%. So to me, it's just another way for people to speculate on speculating. So what do I do with that? There's no data point of research that says that it's right or that it's wrong.
So at this point, you don't like crypto. debt, whatever.
I never have, but I'm not short it. I don't
okay.
short it because there's nothing to short.
How do you get an edge at a time where everyone loves AI? And where everyone's scouring for the plays
So
that are
I'll just
best
give
to
you one
expose them?
example of a stock that I think eventually will become a great AI play, which, I mean, the whole thing about getting an edge, I think, is overrated because most people have all the facts. It's a question of how you interpret the facts. I mean, people think that I had some sort of unbelievable edge about the subprime mortgage sector. I had the same facts everybody else had. I just looked at them differently. So, you know, right now everybody's focused on NVIDIA and AMD and data centers, but one day, and that day is not too far from now, there'll be a lot of AI apps that you and I will use. And we're not going to use them at a data center in the cloud. We're going to want to use them on our phone because we want it at the head end, right here. So at that point, there's going to be, I think, an entire new sales cycle of phones, laptops that are going to need to be upgraded to be able to do all this stuff that eventually we will want to do. That's Apple.
So you're buying Apple aggressively?
Well, we've owned it for a long time, and we continue to own it. But it's not actionable at this second because there hasn't been an app. What app? I don't know. When it shows up, I'll let you know. But until then, but at that point, the phone. I have the new phone. That phone is not going to be probably not going to be capable to do some of the apps that you're going to want to do.
It appears that's the direction of travel. I know you've talked about this in the past. I'd love to hear it again. The electricity grid.
Yes.
The demand on electricity in this country, given where policy is, EVs, where AI is going, how great is it going to be? Are we in a position to supply it?
So the utility budget, CapEx budgets go up every single year. They update them. They do like a 3-year forward look, and it comes out, January when they report, and the utility budgets, 3-year budgets are up 20%. It's an enormous sum. They're going to go up even more because the NVIDIA, AMD chips use a lot more electricity than the CPUs do. So there's even more pressure on the grid. So the cycle of, improving the grid, building, green type of utility structures, whether it's wind and solar or just upgrading what you have, is going to go on for a very, very long time. I'll just mention one stock that I've talked about before.
Please do.
What do utilities do? They send you electricity and they send you a bill. But when they actually have to do something, they hire somebody to do it. So when you hear that utility A is increasing its CapEx budget and is building a solar or whatever, or a gas, whatever, 9 times out of 10, they hire a company called Quanta, which is the largest utility-related engineering company in the country. We've owned it for a long time. But what I would say the amusing thing is I'm on the quarterly call every quarter, and every quarter the CEO looks happier. And you think, hey, I couldn't look happier because he was so happy last quarter, but he's even happier today because he has so much business, he can't do it all.
That's the winner. Is there a loser? Is there a short for you? An active short?
I'm not talking about shorts.
No?
I mean, I do a little shorting for myself, but that's it.
Could you think of a theme, though, associated with that, where there could be a group of companies that would lose in that world?
Well, I would say, just as an uber theme about companies that I probably would not invest in, are, the stocks that did really well, call it 2018, 19, 20, 21, were the very high revenue growth, negative earnings companies. Kind of like public venture capital companies. Those got destroyed in 2022, down literally 75 to 90%. They've come back, but when you're down 75 to 90% and then you go up 50%, it doesn't look so good on a chart. I would just avoid those companies until it becomes very clear that they actually have real business models where they can actually make money.
In just a moment, we'll catch up with our analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence on the Walt Disney Company. That stock is down by about 5% this morning. Can we squeeze in a question on Marvel?
Yes, we can.
Which you have some expertise.
I do.
This conversation could go a whole lot longer than maybe we needed to.
It could go for hours.
What do you think is the problem with the franchise, please?
I'm going to brag a little bit. I own one of the largest digital comic book collections on planet Earth. It's 11,000 comics on my iPad.
Wow.
And I've read all 11,000. So I could write a dissertation on Doctor Strange that would go for 200 pages.
Bob Iger might read it.
Yes, you probably would. It'd be very interesting.
Maybe they should make it into a movie.
So the problem with Marvel movies, to me, is that they had a great story, and it ended. And Iron Man is dead. Captain America is 90. And Thor is, and this really upsets me, and I'm serious about this. They made Thor into a comedic buffoon. And it was always one of my favorite comics. So Thor being a comedic buffoon, I find extremely upsetting.
This is Hemsworth.
Yes, and there's no story anymore. They had a story where they had all these different tangents, but it all wove down into one eventual story, and then it was over. And they have been unable to find a new story. And the problem is that their three great characters are gone. So even if they had a story, who would want to go watch?
Steve, this was
I would
great.
just say, with the final say, just as an example, the last Guardians of the Galaxy movie was unwatchable.